In this session, we're looking at the experiential exercise as one of those bring learning alive strategies from TCI. Experiential exercises tap into students' intrapersonal and bodily kinesthetic intelligences, allowing students to experience key social studies concepts firsthand. These short, memorable activities make abstract ideas or remote events accessible and meaningful. The experiential exercise is one of those core TCI strategies that History Alive has been known for a long time. Very often, students are known to say, "I remember when they recall an experiential exercise. But what's critical here in the experiential exercise is not just that students remember the activity, but that they understand the core concepts that the activity was designed to illustrate. And that really is what we're going to unpack today as we look at TCI experiential exercises. Now, you can see from the photos below, you just get a little bit of a flavor of what experiential exercises look like in some of the different TCI programs. But we're going to dig in, we'll look at the guiding principles of experiential exercises, and then we'll look at some examples. So first, here are the general guidelines for implementing experiential exercises in your classroom. Number one, use short, memorable experiences to help students grasp social studies concepts. Experiential exercises are generally going to last a class period, maybe slightly longer with the debrief, but generally a class period. And in fact, the activity part of the experiential exercise will likely be much less than a class period, maybe as short as 10 to 15 to 20 minutes. Now, this is packaged within an entire lesson that includes the preview, the core activity, in this case, the experiential exercise, and the processing. Okay. All of that may take multiple days for the lesson, but the experiential exercise itself, including the debrief, is generally a class period, maybe a little bit more depending on length of the class period. In other words, these aren't long, drawn-out projects. These aren't multi-day projects. And in fact, we want to make sure that the experiences are closely connected to that debrief so that there's not a large time lag. So remember what I said, students very often remember the activity, but sometimes don't make that connection later on when they remember the activity. What was it we were actually learning? And that's why it's important to keep these short and to keep the debrief closely paired with the activity itself. Secondly, prepare your students for a safe, successful experience. Obviously, there is physical safety that's needed in a classroom. Many of these experiential exercises involve students moving around. They may be in much closer proximity than they are when they're normally seated at their desks in rows. There may be some movement that students towards one another, they're going to be doing physical things, and that's why physical safety is important. But physical safety, it's not limited to physical safety. We also need to be looking at emotional safety, for example. There are going to be times in experiential exercises where there are some tensions in the classroom, maybe some frustrations that students experience in these exercises, and that's intentional because we want students to try to experience what people in history have experienced. But we do have to take a lot of care here. We do have to be mindful that we're not reinforcing trauma or perpetuating stereotypes in these activities. So we do have to make sure that we have prepared students well for physical safety, that we've set the tone for our classroom appropriately and what appropriate decorum is in our classroom. That's why TCI spends so much time on the idea of the cooperative and inclusive classroom. And we also have to make sure that we're providing for that emotional safety. There are just some things that should never be simulated in a classroom. And there are other things that may be gray areas. Maybe for some classes, this is not the kind of activity that may be appropriate. There may be appropriate time and place in which certain kinds of activities because of certain heightened political tensions at a time or in a particular community, you might choose not to do a particular experiential exercise. There's obviously a lot of thought that has to go into this to make sure that students are prepared for the safe, successful experience and whether this particular experience is appropriate for the time and place. Third, we want to try to make the experiences as authentic as possible. That might mean a change in scenery. Maybe instead of being inside the classroom, you go to a larger space. Maybe it's a gymnasium, maybe you go outside to have a more authentic experience. It might mean bringing in props or costumes. Obviously, we can't recreate exactly whatever historical experience we're trying to recreate. And depending on the experiential exercise, that may not be entirely necessary to use things like props and costumes, but we want to make it somewhat authentic so that students can have that feeling of what it was like to be in this particular situation. Fourth, allow students to express their feelings immediately after the experience. Again, part of safety and that emotional safety there may be times when students experience some frustration and tension in the activity. And so we want to, in that process of beginning to debrief and connect this to the social studies concepts, allow students to express their feelings. This is how we build empathy, which is a very important concept that I think gets left out in history classes and social studies classes. How do we build empathy? And I think experiential exercises, even though we can't recreate experiences exactly as they were experienced, we're trying to give just this short, memorable experience that allows students to have the feeling of what it was like and to experience empathy. And 5, ask carefully sequenced questions to help students make connections between their experience and the key concepts or events. Again, the critical part here being the connection. What did we do in class? And then how did we relate it to social studies? One of the things I like about this is as we think about what we're going to do in the class in terms of experiential exercises, is we're not really starting with, let's think about an engaging activity. We're starting with what are the key concepts that we want to communicate. And so this is really tailor-made for concept-based learning. That is, let's think about the concepts we want to communicate, and then how can we use a bodily kinesthetic experience to help students understand that concept? Let's make it more concrete here and look at some examples from various TCI programs. So from grade 6 in our custom program, students portray traders on the Silk Road who try to acquire different products by traveling and exchanging goods. As they move along the Silk Road, they perform actions that represent the dangers of travel. So we're trying to here give a kind of role play experience of what it's like to be a trader on the Silk Road. In grade 7, students take on roles of members of government to debate advantages and disadvantages of 3 methods used by rulers to select civil servants to help the emperor govern China. So we're talking here about government in medieval China. In grade 8, students play 6 rounds of capture the flag that are analogous to the course of the War for American Independence. And in each round, the rules change to tilt the outcome of the game so that it reflects how the Continental Army was able to defeat the British. Now you can see from these 3 examples, and we'll look at some high school examples in just a second, but you can see these are specific to historical time and place. But in many cases, as we start to unpack experiential exercises, you'll see that there might be application beyond the specific historical periods. Are there other times and place when people have engaged in trade? Could we use this same kind of activity to illustrate trade in another time and place? Or if we're looking at what makes a good civil servant in medieval China, could there also be some application to other historical examples or contemporary examples? Could capture the flag, or could some similar type of game illustrate another historical event or concept? So Again, time and place bound, but are there other ways in which we can incorporate experiential exercise to illustrate similar concepts? We want to begin, I'm going to coin a new term called thinking experiential exercise. Right? That is thinking about how to incorporate the idea of experiential exercise. Obviously, in the TCI programs, these are laid out for you. So that's great. And as I mentioned, they're part of a larger lesson that will include the preview and the processing packaged around the experiential exercise. But we can also begin to adapt and think through how we want to incorporate our own experiential exercises. So let's go back to some examples. Here from World Connections in grade 9, students act as a work brigade manufacturing cars, and then they shop at a store in order to model the Soviet economy prior to economic reforms. And this is one that I've done in my own classroom, and it can get very interesting. When you get into this, students will manufacture cars. They'll be paid in rubles. They'll have the opportunity to go to a store, but the store's not going to stay open very long because there's going to be a lot of shortage in supplies and staples that people want to buy at the store. Here's one from Pursuing American Ideals. Students play a red dot game. That is, they form groups of non-dots, that is, students who have a slip of paper that does not have a dot on it. Or if the students have a slip of paper that has a dot, their goal is to infiltrate into the group. And that can help them to understand the anti-communist hysteria during the Cold War. So accusations are going to be thrown around as students try to form these groups of students as to who has a dot and who doesn't have a dot. Again, this can be applied to other situations. It's often applied in the Salem witch trials, for example. From Government Alive, students work in groups to create informational websites about simulated presidential candidates and interest groups before participating in a meet and greet to learn about the relationship between politicians and interest groups. Again, I hope you get from these 6 examples just a little bit of the flavor of the kinds of things that experiential exercises involve. Sometimes it's a game-like activity, sometimes it's more of a role play kind of activity, but all of them designed to speak to a specific historical concept. Now, where do we find these experiential exercises in our programs? That depends a little bit on which program you have. If you're using one of the custom programs, grade 6, 7, or global issues, it uses what's called the older format here, what I call the older format. And that is, you'll see here under this modify view, you can see, just make sure you have that checked as the teaching strategy. So this is right from the content page, and you'll see down here it says teaching strategy experiential exercise for this on lesson 2. Now that's only for those older custom programs. In the more standard TCI programs that we have, for example, in grade 8, 9, 10, and 11 through Government Alive, you'll see that you have to dig into the lesson a little bit. So in the lesson overview in this planning, you'll see the entirety of the lesson drawn out here, and it will say activity experiential exercise. So that's when you know you're encountering an experiential exercise in your lesson. And again, TCI being a turnkey program, the idea is that it tells you how to do this experiential exercise. The value, I think, again, and what we're bringing to the table in discussing this today is how do you prepare your students to do it well, and how do you think experiential exercisely? So let's dig in and let's take a look at an example. This is not one that I have previously referenced in the slides, but in this experiential exercise, students are going to participate in a trading game to explore how people gain and exercise power. This is one that I think, even though this comes from our Government Alive program, I think it has a lot of application beyond just Government Alive. I think it can be used in history classes and economics, in any situations in which we're talking about how people gain and exercise power. And keep in mind that power is one of our big 6 ideas, along with those overarching essential questions that go along with it. So let's go ahead and dig in. I'm going to take you out to the slideshow. And again, this is in every program. Every TCI lesson has a slideshow with it. And you'll see here the full lesson with all of the preview. And this is one where you may decide whether or not you want to do the preview first. You may actually want to use the experiential exercise as a kind of a preview and maybe come back to that particular preview activity. So when I get up to slide 8, now I have the actual experiential exercise directions. And so we're going to play a chip game. And what's going to happen is students are going to trade these different colored chips. So for each round, they're going to have 2 minutes to trade. Okay. And after the trading round, the student with the most points will be asked to make a rule for the next round. And that rule only applies for that next round. So you as the teacher are going to distribute chips. You can use note cards, you can use actual small chips, you can use cardstock, paper, whatever. You just need to have something with these various colors. Now, the key is in this first round, that's all you've told students, right? They don't know anything about point values of these specific colors. All they know is they're asked to trade. So they may be developing their own thoughts and strategies about this and thinking about what might make me a winner here, but they don't know yet. They don't know how much anything is worth, or is it just quantity, right? They don't know that the colors represent anything significant. After round 1, you're going to then expose the scoring guide and figure out who has the most points. So now students have a system that tells them who has the most points based on the color scheme. One thing that's really critical here is that you should be stacking the deck. Okay? That is, students should have different amounts and colors to start with. And you as the teacher will know the significance of that. Right? So you want to make sure that there comes out a pretty clear winner here. And so someone will have quite a few more pink cards in their stack. They're not going to necessarily see that at first unless they sit and count them out, but you're going to move this activity pretty quickly to start with, so students won't necessarily even be paying attention to the number of cards they have or the colors of them, because they're not even going to know the significance of the colors at first, right? So calculate that. Now the student with the most points gets to make a rule for the next round. Okay? The new rule cannot end all trading and will apply only to the next round. So obviously that student, if they're savvy, is going to understand, okay, I'm going to make a rule that favors me. Right? They can change the point values. So they may want to change the point values because they had a lot of pink cards, and so now pink cards are going to be worth 1,000 points. And that's going to make sure that they probably stay in power during this round 2 trading. Should mention here that there's also some lesson support that's given here. There are some hint cards it references here, and we can take a look at those hint cards in just a minute. But the hint cards will kind of help students to formulate rules and to think about how to form alliances as they're trading, to help students win the game in the next rounds. So after round 2, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to calculate these points, find out who has the most. Again, there are some hint cards that I'll distribute. And then we're going to play round 3. Follow this same process. Okay, so what happens during this game is that, students start to figure out here now, some of the rules may have changed, but they're also figuring out how to stay in power or how to acquire power. And generally by round 3, someone new has acquired power, right, from that original one based on a change in the rule. Again, important part of this is debriefing the activity, allowing students to sort of express their feelings and what they just experienced immediately after the activity. So this is all occurring in the same class period. What happened to you during the game? What happened in the class? Okay. Were there some subversive activities? Students trying to form alliances and teams and make underhanded deals. That kind of thing happens. What do you think this game was about? So why are we doing this game, right? And based on this experience, how would you define power? And why might power be related to a course on American politics and government? Although, again, you could use this to illustrate plenty of historical examples as well. Once they've done that, students are going to begin to dig into the textbook, read the various sections, and complete the notebook. As with all activities, it ends in a processing. And in this case, the processing assignment asks students to read the quotations on power, assess how true or false you believe them, then write briefly about a response to them. So over here in this materials button, I can find access to this handout on power. And I'll see, after having experienced this activity in which they experienced power or lack thereof, now we're going to ask them some questions about power. And again, now they've read a little bit in the textbook as well and understand some of that background about power. But this is the connection to the historical concept. Just one example of a way I think an experiential exercise has very broad application across many content areas. And again, you can see these quotes on power come from various people across various countries and historical periods. So you can certainly make these connections in a history class as well as a government class. So that's just a very quick look at one example of an experiential exercise. What I want us to do again is to begin to think about, though, how do I incorporate my own experiential exercises into class, right? How can I incorporate kinesthetic learning, role play, simulation, and games to introduce key social studies concepts? The goal in adopting TCI and History Alive and Government Alive and Geography Alive is never to simply hand you a program and to say, here are the lessons, do it exactly as it is, and don't ask any questions, right? And don't think for yourself. That's not the goal at all. The goal is, here's a model lesson. You're going to adapt them as you see fit. And the more times you teach a particular lesson and do an experiential exercise, you will develop adaptations of it. You will develop your own variations of it. You will play off what happens in the experience with students. Again, me just talking about it and sort of walking you through the exercise in this video is really not the most effective way to do an experiential exercise. Obviously, if we were together in the same space, we would be doing this as an actual activity, an actual experiential exercise. And you would start to see how you might modify and adapt that. You might, from period 1 to period 8, change this experiential exercise over time because you see certain things happening. Right? Or maybe your students start talking about it between classes and you realize I have to make a change up here because they already know the point values of the cards, right? On the way out the door, first period can tell all the second period students, make sure you get the pink cards, right? And they'll have no idea what you're talking about until they start the activity, right? So you might have to change that up a little bit. That's just one example of a way you might start adapting some of these as you go. But again, as you develop comfort and expertise in facilitating experiential exercises or any TCI strategies, you'll really find that the power of TCI is the power to adapt it and to make it work for you. I give you some examples here. Not too long ago, I was at the store and I saw this Monopoly deal game. Now, I've played regular Monopoly plenty of times, but I had never seen it in this card game version. And so I was looking at it, cost maybe $6 or $7. I picked up a copy. I wanted to see if this is something that could be useful in a classroom. And it turns out you can play this game in about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit longer with larger groups. And you can go online and read the directions and see videos and how to do this. But in many ways, it illustrates some of the same concepts that we just talked about in the trading game about power, but it can also be used to illustrate economic concepts, right? Why do people engage in trade? How do people come to have monopolies, and what are the consequences of that? You can, of course, use it in historical examples about the rise of big business. You could use it to talk about economic imperialism, all of those kinds of things. And so that was just a way I was thinking experiential exercising, right? I wanted to think about how can I give students an experience, in this case, a game, that might mirror some actual concepts that I want them to know about how economics works, or how historically the rise of big business and monopolies were created. So that's a way of thinking experiential exercise. Maybe for you, you're thinking about a core concept like types of government, and you want to provide students with a kind of role play or simulation in which you're making a classroom decision in different kinds of ways, depending on what type of government you want to illustrate. Right? That might be a very low prop, kind of really low prep and low prop kind of activity, is to simply pose some sort of question that you want the class to be able to address about a class policy. And in one round, you might allow them to vote as if it's democratic. And in another round, it might simply be you as the dictator teacher, or a small group of students might get to decide for everyone else. I mean, there's all sorts of directions you could take this to illustrate that concept. Again, that's just another way of thinking experiential exercisely. So, again, to recap our experiential exercise guidelines. We're using short, memorable experiences to help students grasp social studies concepts. And we're starting by thinking about the concepts that we want students to know. We're preparing them for a safe, successful experience, physically safe, emotionally safe. We're making the experience as authentic as possible. We're allowing them to express their feelings immediately after the experience. And we're asking those carefully sequenced questions to help students make connections between their experience and the key concepts or events. As you implement experiential exercise, you might think about, maybe there's something else I want to add to these general guidelines. Again, that's part of making TCI work for you. But hopefully you find in these guidelines a good starting point for implementing experiential exercise in the social studies classroom.